Karen slaps my kid and calls the cops when I refuse to let her in. If someone had told me 6 months ago that my peaceful dream of suburban life would be shattered by the meddling neighbor next door, I'd have laughed. The very thought of it felt absurd. My husband David and I had worked tirelessly for years, saving every extra penny and sacrificing countless little luxuries, all for one goal: to leave behind the suffocating grind of city life. The cramped apartment, the endless noise, the constant rush. It was exhausting, and we wanted better for our family. We dreamed of a quiet place where we could breathe, where our 10-year-old son Ryan could grow up surrounded by trees instead of traffic, and where we could finally feel like we were building a life worth living. In truth, I'd been dreaming of a place like this long before I even met David. I grew up in a small town in the Midwest, where everyone knew everyone, and summer days felt endless. My parents weren't wealthy by any means. My dad worked as a mechanic, and my mom juggled part-time jobs while raising my siblings and me. But what we lacked in money, we made up for in love. I can still picture our tiny house with its creaky wooden porch, the smell of freshly cut grass, and the sound of cicadas humming in the evening. It wasn't perfect, far from it. I remember the fights over bills, the hand-me-down clothes, and the constant worry about what would happen if the car broke down again. But there was also a sense of simplicity and belonging that I've spent my entire adult life chasing. I didn't realize it at the time, but that little house, with its leaky roof and mismatched curtains, was the happiest place in the world to me. When I left for college, I was determined to make something of myself. I wanted to escape the financial struggles my parents faced and carve out a future where I didn't have to worry about making ends meet. Teaching seemed like the perfect path. A steady job, a chance to make a difference, and a way to honor my mom, who had always dreamed of being a teacher herself but never had the opportunity. For years, I poured my heart into my work, believing that I was building a life worth living. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of what truly mattered. The city, with all its chaos and opportunities, swallowed me whole. Teaching became less about the joy of learning and more about test scores, lesson plans, and impossible expectations. The tiny apartment David and I shared felt like a shoebox, and the constant noise of sirens and shouting kept me awake most nights. Even when Ryan was born, I struggled to find balance. I was trying so hard to give him everything I never had that I didn't notice how much I was missing. His first words, his giggles, the way his face lit up when he learned something new. The move was supposed to change all that. It was my chance to slow down, to give Ryan the kind of childhood I'd had, where he could run barefoot in the grass and come home smelling like sunshine. David and I had spent years saving for this, dreaming of a house where we could finally breathe. The house itself was everything I'd ever wanted. A charming bungalow on a corner lot, complete with a cozy front porch and a spacious backyard. The porch swing reminded me of the one at my parents' house, where my mom used to sit and hum to herself while she watched the sunset. The backyard was a blank slate, waiting to be turned into the kind of magical space I'd always imagined for Ryan. A place where he could climb trees, build forts, and maybe even plant a little garden with me. It was more than a house. It was a promise, a fresh start for all of us. And the neighborhood seemed perfect. The streets were quiet, lined with trees and neatly trimmed lawns. I caught glimpses of kids around Ryan's age riding bikes and playing tag. For the first time in years, I felt hopeful, like we'd finally found a place where we could put down roots and belong. I told myself we'd settle in quickly. I'd unpack the boxes, make the house feel like home, and soon enough, we'd be hosting barbecues and making friends. I clung to that optimism, nurtured it like a fragile flame. After all, I'd worked so hard to get here. Surely, this was the happy ending we deserved. But optimism has a funny way of biting you when you least expect it. The first 2 weeks were hectic. Unpacking boxes, rearranging furniture, and adjusting to the slower pace of suburban life kept us busy. David spent most of his time locked in his home office, and Ryan was still getting used to the idea of not seeing his old friends every day. It wasn't easy, but I knew it would get better. Or at least I hoped it would. One thing I quickly noticed was how curious the neighbors were. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel their eyes on me. A quick glance toward the windows of the houses across the street confirmed it. Peeking curtains and shadowy silhouettes. It wasn't hostile, just nosy. I figured it was small-town culture, where everyone wanted to know who the new folks were. One neighbor stood out immediately. Cheryl, the woman next door. I'd seen her a handful of times, always impeccably dressed in pastel-colored tracksuits that screamed suburban royalty. She spent hours in her front yard, either watering her flowers or walking her tiny, yappy dog. She had this air about her, like she owned the entire block. Her sharp eyes followed us as we moved in, and though she never introduced herself, her judgment was palpable. Cheryl had Karen energy written all over her. I mentally prepared myself for the day she'd march over to lay down the law. Little did I know, that day would come far sooner than I expected. One Saturday morning, Ryan and I decided to tackle the daunting task of grocery shopping. After days of living off takeout, our fridge and pantry were embarrassingly empty. David, predictably, was stuck on a work call, so it was just me and Ryan. The drive to the store was a nice bonding moment. Ryan talked excitedly about how he wanted to decorate his new room and asked when he could invite friends over to play in the backyard. It made me happy to see him adjusting, even if the move hadn't been easy for him. Once we got to the store, the chaos began. Between Ryan sneaking boxes of sugary cereal into the cart and me trying to remember everything we needed, it felt like a workout. By the time we finished loading the car with groceries, we were both exhausted. "We're never running out of food again," Ryan declared, slumping into the passenger seat. I couldn't agree more. When we got home, David was still glued to his computer, muttering something about a deadline. I didn't bother interrupting him. Instead, Ryan and I started unloading the groceries. It was a sunny day, and the driveway was bathed in warm light as we carried bag after bag into the house. Ryan insisted on helping, even though some of the bags were almost as big as he was. I smiled, grateful for his enthusiasm. I was unpacking a bag of canned goods in the kitchen when I realized Ryan hadn't come back inside. I frowned, glancing at the clock. It wasn't like him to dawdle. I walked over to the window, expecting to see him struggling with a heavy bag or distracted by something in the yard. Instead, I saw Cheryl. She was standing in our driveway, her hands on her hips, and she was talking to Ryan. No, she was yelling at him. I couldn't make out the words, but her face was twisted in anger. My heart sank. What was she doing? Before I could react, the front door slammed shut, and Ryan came running into the kitchen. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he clutched the edge of the counter. "Mom," he gasped, She tried to come inside." "What?" I asked, rushing to him. "Who tried to come inside?" "Her," he cried, pointing toward the window. "The lady next door. Cheryl. She said the house was hers." My stomach twisted into knots. "What are you talking about?" I asked, trying to stay calm for his sake. "She told me to let her inside," Ryan said, his voice shaky. "She said she used to live here and that we stole her house. And then she said I need to let her back in." I stared at him, my mind racing. None of this made any sense. "What did you do?" I asked, desperate to piece it all together. "I told her no," Ryan said, his voice breaking. "And she got mad. She tried to push past me. So I slammed the door and locked it." I hugged Ryan tightly, trying to reassure him that everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure myself. After a few minutes, I peeked through the window. Cheryl was still there. If there's one thing I've learned from this ordeal, it's that some people just don't know when to stop. Cheryl didn't leave quietly after Ryan slammed the door on her bizarre rant. In fact, she escalated things in a way that made me question her sanity. I was still hugging Ryan, trying to calm him down, when I heard her voice again, this time louder and more shrill. She was outside, pacing on the sidewalk in front of our house and screaming at the top of her lungs. "You think you can steal from me and get away with it? I'm calling the police. You'll regret this, you liars." I peeked out the window to see her jabbing at her phone, presumably dialing 911. Her face was bright red, and she looked like she was seconds away from an aneurysm. I felt a mix of emotions: embarrassment, anger, and disbelief. How could someone act so unhinged over something so absurd? Ryan clung to my side, his small hands gripping my shirt tightly. "Mom," he whispered, his voice trembling. Is she going to make us leave? What if the police believe her? I knelt down to his level, trying to mask my own anxiety. No one is going to make us leave, I said firmly. This is our house, Ryan. We have the papers to prove it. She's just being ridiculous. I smoothed his hair and gave him a reassuring smile. Let her scream all she wants. It doesn't change the truth. Cheryl's shouting continued, her voice carrying through the otherwise quiet neighborhood. I saw a few curtains twitch as curious neighbors peeked out, but no one came outside. It was like they were afraid to get involved, or maybe they just didn't want to deal with Cheryl. Couldn't blame them. She's insane, I muttered under my breath as I checked the lock on the front door for the third time. I wasn't taking any chances. Ryan sat on the couch, his knees pulled to his chest, watching me with wide eyes. The screaming outside grew louder. Cheryl was now ranting about how we were squatters who had broken into her home and stolen her property. Her claims made no sense, but the sheer conviction in her voice was unsettling. I forced myself to stay calm. Let her call the police, I thought. Once they get here, they'll see how ridiculous she's being. I sat down next to Ryan, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. We're going to be okay, I said. Just stay inside and don't open the door, no matter what. He nodded, though I could see the fear still lingering in his eyes. The distant wail of sirens cut through the air, and I felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. Finally, someone with authority would deal with Cheryl. But as the sound grew closer, I noticed Ryan's expression shift. His curiosity was starting to outweigh his fear. Mom, can I see the police? He asked, already sliding off the couch. No, I said quickly. Stay right here. Let me handle this. But before I could stop him, he darted to the door, drawn by the flashing lights outside. Ryan, wait, I called, but it was too late. He unlocked the door and pulled it open just as the police car came to a stop in front of our house. That's when everything went from bad to worse. The moment Ryan opened the door, Cheryl made her move. She rushed up the steps, shoving past him with surprising force. Get out of my house, she screamed, her face twisted in rage. Ryan stumbled backward, trying to block her path, but Cheryl lashed out. Her hand struck his face with a sharp crack, and I saw him fall to the floor, clutching his cheek. A red welt began to form almost instantly, and I spotted a small cut where one of her rings had dug into his skin. Mom! He cried out, and something inside me snapped. I don't remember crossing the room. I just remember the sheer rage that consumed me. 1 second I was on the couch, and the next I was at Ryan's side, pulling him into my arms and yelling at Cheryl to get out. What the hell is wrong with you? I shouted, my voice shaking with anger. You just hit my son. Amid the chaos, David finally appeared. He had been in his office, his noise-canceling headphones on, oblivious to the shouting outside. When he came into the living room, his face was a mix of confusion and alarm. What's going on? He asked, taking in the scene, Cheryl's hysterics, and Ryan's tear-streaked face. Cheryl, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, just hit Ryan. She forced her way inside and attacked him. David's eyes widened, and his jaw tightened. She what? His voice was low and furious, the kind of tone I'd only heard a handful of times in our marriage. He immediately crouched down beside Ryan, checking his cheek and asking if he was okay. Ryan nodded shakily, though tears continued to roll down his face. I'm okay, Dad, he whispered. It just hurts. David stood, his fists clenched at his sides as he turned toward Cheryl. You hit my son? He demanded, his voice rising. What the hell is wrong with you? The police officers quickly stepped in, placing themselves between Cheryl and us. One of them grabbed her by the arm, pulling her back toward the door. Ma'am, that's enough, he said firmly. You need to step outside. As the police restrained Cheryl, she continued to rant, though her tone shifted from unhinged rage to self-righteous indignation. I was in talks with the previous owner, she shouted, her words directed more at the officers than at me. We had an agreement. He promised to sell this house to me. I even paid him a deposit. I froze for a moment, processing her words. This was new information, and while it sounded outlandish, it wasn't completely outside the realm of possibility. Cheryl's anger didn't come from nowhere. It came from entitlement and what she believed was a broken promise. The officer standing next to her tilted his head. "Ma'am, are you saying you paid the previous owner for this property?" "Yes," she snapped. "I wrote him a check. We agreed on the price, and I was ready to close, but then these people swooped in and offered him more money. He sold it to them instead, and I never got my deposit back. They stole my house." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "We didn't steal anything," I said firmly, stepping forward. "We went through a real estate agent, made a legitimate offer, and closed on this house. We've never even met the previous owner." The second officer turned to me, his expression calm but firm. "Ma'am, do you have any documentation to prove ownership of this property?" "Yes," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me. "The deed and mortgage papers are on the dining table." "I'll get them." I walked to the table, where the neatly stacked paperwork still sat from earlier. Grateful for my procrastination in filing them away, I grabbed the documents and handed them to the officer. He took his time reviewing them, flipping through the pages with care. After a few moments, he nodded. "The documents are clear," he said, turning to Cheryl. "This property legally belongs to the current owners. If you believe you've been defrauded by the previous owner, you'll need to address that with him, not these folks." Cheryl's face twisted with frustration, and for a moment, I thought she might explode again. But instead, she slumped slightly, muttering under her breath about how unfair it all was. The officer shook his head. "I think it's time we take this conversation down to the station," he said, motioning for his partner to escort Cheryl to the car. The moment Cheryl was led toward the police car, ranting about being cheated out of her rightful home, a wave of exhaustion washed over me. Her face was twisted in anger as she shouted about how unfair the system was, insisting that the previous owner had promised her the house. "I'm the victim here," she yelled, her voice hoarse from hours of screaming. David stood next to me in the doorway, one hand on Ryan's shoulder and the other clenched into a fist at his side. We exchanged a glance, silently relieved the nightmare was finally being dealt with. Ryan leaned into David for comfort. His face was swollen, and though he hadn't cried since the altercation, the fear was evident in his eyes. One of the officers approached me while Cheryl was being loaded into the car. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but serious, "given the nature of this incident, we need to know if you'd like to press charges against her for the assault on your son and trespassing." I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said firmly. "She scared my family and hurt my son. She can't get away with this." The officer nodded, making a note in his pad. "We'll ensure this is handled. I'm sorry you had to go through this." As the police car pulled away, Cheryl's shouting faded into the distance. I turned back to my family, ready to pick up the pieces. The next morning, just as I was beginning to process what had happened, my phone buzzed with a call from the investigating officer. He wanted to update me on Cheryl's claims. "Ma'am," he began, "we've looked into the accusation Cheryl made about paying the previous owner a deposit for the house. We found no evidence to support her story." Relief washed over me. "What did you find out?" I asked. He explained that the previous owner had been contacted and categorically denied receiving any money from Cheryl. "She inquired about the house," the officer said, "but there was never an agreement or payment. Her claim is completely fabricated." I felt a flicker of anger. Cheryl's lies had upended our lives and terrified my family, all based on some twisted sense of entitlement. "So what happens now?" I asked. "We'll be adding her false claims to the charges against her," he replied. "Between that, the assault, and the trespassing, the case against her is solid." I thanked him and hung up, feeling a sense of vindication but still rattled by how far Cheryl had gone. Cheryl was formally charged with assault, trespassing, and filing a false police report. When the case went to court, she pleaded not guilty, insisting she had been justified in her actions. She stood by her story about the deposit and claimed we had stolen the house out from under her. Her self-righteousness was almost impressive in its audacity. During the trial, Cheryl's past came to light. It turned out this wasn't her first brush with the law. She had 3 prior incidents of filing false police reports, one of which involved accusing a neighbor's teenage son of stealing her garden tools that were later found in her own garage. She also had a previous charge for assault, stemming from a dispute at a grocery store. Her courtroom behavior didn't help her case. Cheryl frequently interrupted the proceedings, shouting about how she was the real victim and how the system was rigged against her. The judge, clearly unimpressed, reprimanded her multiple times. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Between our documentation, the police reports, and the testimony from the previous owner, Cheryl's defense crumbled. She was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 18 months in prison. When the verdict was read, she erupted into another tirade, accusing everyone in the courtroom of conspiring against her. As we left the courthouse, David and I shared a quiet moment of relief. Justice had been served, and Cheryl wouldn't be bothering us for a long time. In the weeks following Cheryl's sentencing, we focused on rebuilding our sense of normalcy. Ryan was still skittish, jumping at loud noises and refusing to go near the front door alone. David and I sat him down one evening to reassure him. "Cheryl is gone," David said gently. "She can't hurt you anymore, and she won't be coming back." Ryan looked at us with wide eyes. "Are you sure?" I nodded. "We're sure." To help Ryan feel safe, David upgraded our home security system, installing cameras and reinforced locks. The extra precautions gave all of us peace of mind. Meanwhile, I focused on making our house feel like a home again. We hung family photos, painted the walls, and finally finished unpacking. We also started getting to know our neighbors. Many of them came by to introduce themselves after hearing about the incident. Some even shared their own stories about Cheryl's behavior. Apparently, she had a reputation for being difficult, though no one had expected her to go this far. Beyond the new security measures, we took additional steps to protect our family. We filed for a restraining order against Cheryl, ensuring she wouldn't be allowed anywhere near us after her release. It was a precaution, but one we felt was necessary. We also joined a local neighborhood group, which turned out to be a great way to build connections and feel more at ease in our new community. The support and kindness from our neighbors helped us heal, reminding us that Cheryl's actions didn't define the neighborhood as a whole. As I look back on the ordeal, I'm struck by how much it tested us as a family. Moving to this house was supposed to be a fresh start, a chance to create a better life for Ryan. Instead, we were thrown into chaos almost immediately. But through it all, we stood together. This experience taught me a lot about people, both the worst and the best of them. Now, as I watch Ryan decorate his room and talk excitedly about starting school, I feel hopeful. This house is finally starting to feel like home, despite its rocky beginning.